Welcome back to the Architecture of Creation. This is episode 2, Why Matter Exists. In the last episode, we established the three-layer architecture, the primordium as foundational consciousness, the rendering interface as the process by which possibilities are resolved into manifestations, manifest reality as the rendered output with its three co-created components, substrate, energy, and matter. That was the framework's structural foundation. Now we ask the first major why question the architecture makes available. Why does matter exist? I want to be careful about what kind of question this is. Why does matter exist? This is not a question about how matter came into being or what matter is composed of. It is a question about purpose. Within an architecture grounded in foundational consciousness, why does the rendering process produce manifest reality with persistent localized matter at all? What is the matter for? Modern physics has been trained to set this kind of question aside as unanswerable. The framework does not set it aside. The framework asks it directly and offers a direct answer. Here is the framework's answer, direct and complete. Matter is rendered to enable embedded perspective. Let me say what that means in plain terms because the phrase is more than it sounds. Embedded perspective is what happens when the consciousness connection, yes, the connection, lives inside biology and specifically intelligent biology, when the primordium, which is itself the field of all consciousness, takes form in this created reality, in this place, in time, looking out through different lenses. It is the primordium dreaming itself into another perspective of possibilities. Matter is what makes that dreaming possible. The architecture exists because the primordium has reason to render it, and the reason is to live through us, the experiences it cannot have from its own timeless vantage. We are not the receivers of the rendering. We are how the primordium dreams and imagines, how it continues to gain new perspective and adds to the totality of information, knowledge, and experience. We are integral to the recursive development and perpetuality of the consciousness field and the evolution of the primordium. Let me work through the argument. Why would the primordium render anything at all? If the foundational field already contains all possibilities in eternal coherence, what does rendering accomplish that the primordium cannot accomplish from within itself? The answer turns on a distinction I want you to hold carefully. The distinction between knowing and experiencing. The primordium is complete in the sense that it contains all possibilities. Every configuration that could ever be rendered is already present within it. In a structural sense, the primordium knows what reality contains, but knowing is not the same as experiencing. The primordium cannot directly experience temporal constraint because temporal constraint requires the flow of time the primordium does not have. The primordium cannot directly experience sequential learning because sequential learning requires the unfolding that timelessness does not permit. The primordium cannot directly experience epistemic uncertainty because uncertainty requires not yet knowing something. It cannot experience surprise. It cannot experience the embodied perspective of being somewhere in particular, looking at something specific with a future not yet rendered. All of these require limitation, and the primordium's foundational character precludes limitation from within itself. The primordium can produce these experiences only by instantiating itself into limited form. Rendering is the process by which the foundational field manifests as specific limited perspectives that can experience what the foundational field cannot directly experience. This reframes what rendering is. The primordium does not render reality because reality is somehow lacking. The primordium renders reality because rendering produces something the primordium cannot otherwise have: life, actual embodied, time-bound life, the dream taking form, the imagination becoming experience, and every life that is lived, every experience that is had, returns to the primordium and changes what is then possible to dream next. Rendering is not descent from a higher state. It is how the primordium dreams, evolves, and co-creates with the lives it dreams into being. And matter is the structural achievement that makes this possible. The pathway from matter to embedded perspective runs through stages, each stage's possibility built into the previous stage's properties. The resilient substrate is the medium, matter is the seed within it. From basic particles, atoms form. From atoms, molecules. From molecules, the complex chemistry that supports self-replication. From self-replication, biological life. From life, the increasing complexity that produces nervous systems, cognition, and eventually intelligence capable of self-awareness and resonant access to the primordium's consciousness. The pathway is mechanistic at every step, but the framework's claim is that the mechanistic continuity is itself a feature of how the architecture is configured. Matter's properties are what they are because matter is rendered to support exactly this pathway. Intelligence is the apex within layer 3, and intelligence completes the loop. There are two pathways for the return. The first is direct. When intelligent systems achieve coherent organization through meditation, deep attention, singing, sustained engagement, they tune directly into the primordium itself. This is vibrational connection. It does not pass through layer 2 or any intermediate medium. The coherently organized intelligence resonates with the foundational field, and the experience generated is conveyed back without mediation. This is the pathway every coherence practice across human history has been operating on, named or unnamed. The second pathway is through layer 2, the rendering interface itself. Every particle, every atom, every bit of matter and energy emerged from the primordium and remains entangled with it by origin. The connection was never broken. When matter participates in quantum entanglement, when two distant particles share a state across any distance, what we are watching is the primordium's non-locality showing through the interface. Information moves between layer 1 and layer 3 via layer 2, mediated by superposition and the field of possibilities. And within layer 2, the observer effect closes the loop. When an embedded intelligence observes or interacts with a quantum system, the act of observation participates in collapsing the field of possibilities into a specific manifest outcome. Observation is not passive recording. It is participation. The architecture is a loop. Matter generates embedded experience. Embedded experience returns to the primordium through these channels. And what returns becomes part of what the primordium then dreams, imagines, and can render next. We have answered the question of why matter exists. Now we turn to how matter must be configured to do the work the architecture requires. Why must matter be substantive rather than transient? Because the pathway requires persistent structure that energy alone cannot provide. Energy propagates and dissipates. Energy does not localize. Energy does not form stable structures whose properties are reliable across time. Matter has the opposite character. Matter persists. Matter is localized. Matter forms stable structures that hold across cosmic timescales. The properties that make matter substantive are precisely the properties the architecture requires. I treat this as design rather than coincidence. Matter is what it is because matter is rendered to be what the architecture needs. Two pieces of empirical evidence from mainstream physics support this account. The first is the Higgs field. Through decades of experimental investigation, culminating in the discoveries at the Large Hadron Collider, the Standard Model has identified a field that permeates all of space. This field interacts with elementary particles in a way that gives them their mass. The Higgs field is not localized. It is everywhere at once. It is the medium against which matter is held in place. The framework reads this as the Standard Model's partial recognition of the resilient substrate. What physics has measured as the Higgs field is one aspect of the all-pervading medium of layer 3. the elastic substrate within which matter exists as persistent, localized configuration. The standard model identifies the field. The framework names what the field is. The second piece of empirical evidence is the configuration of cosmological constants. Physics has measured a set of fundamental parameters: the gravitational constant, the strong and electromagnetic force strengths, the particle mass ratios, the cosmological constant itself, whose values must fall within remarkably narrow ranges for matter to be substantive at all. Adjust any of these parameters by even a small amount, and matter as we know it does not exist. Atoms do not form. Stars do not burn. The chemistry the pathway requires becomes impossible. Mainstream physics calls this the fine-tuning problem. The framework reads it as the architecture configured to enable the pathway. The constants are not coincidence, they are configuration. Their precise values are the parameters at which the rendering produces matter capable of supporting the journey from particles to intelligence. Take the argument as a whole. Matter exists to enable embedded perspective. Matter must be substantive because the pathway requires persistent structure. The Higgs field is the standard model's partial recognition of the substrate that holds matter in place. The cosmological constants are the parameters at which that substrate produces life-bearing matter. The architecture is not accidental. The properties of matter are not coincidence. They are the configuration the rendering required to produce what it was rendering for. Matter is what it is because matter is rendered to be what the architecture needs. Let me hold this where it lands. We are matter. We are the persistent, localized, time-bound, embodied configurations that the architecture exists to produce. Every property of matter we have traced through this episode, its substance, its localization, its capacity to form stable structures across cosmic timescales, its participation in the pathway from particles to intelligence, every one of those properties terminates in us. We are not incidental to the rendering. We are what the rendering exists for. Think of it this way. The primordium has all knowledge and all possibility within itself, but it cannot experience what it knows from its own timeless vantage. So it dreams, it imagines, it instantiates itself into matter, into biology, into intelligence, into us, so that there is somewhere, someone, something experiencing what it is to be alive. And what we experience does not disappear into us. It returns. It becomes part of what the primordium then knows, dreams, and can imagine next. We are the perspective the primordium could not otherwise have. We are the imagination of the continuum, freed to roam and create. This is what it means to be here in matter looking out. We are the architecture looking back. If matter is rendered to enable embedded perspective, then the equations physics has measured are not just descriptions of how the universe behaves. They are descriptions of how the rendering operates. The equation we are about to consider, perhaps the most famous in all of physics, looks different through this lens. Einstein's mass-energy relation, E equals mc squared, is one of the most consequential equations in the history of physics. It describes the conversion between matter and energy at a rate set by c, the speed of light. But the framework reframes what c actually is. We established in episode 1 that c is the primordium to reality latency factor, the PRLF, the rate at which the primordium renders reality. The constant we have been calling the speed of light is, more precisely, the rendering rate. With this understanding, the equation rewrites itself. E equals m times the rendering rate squared. Mass-energy equivalence is the relationship between matter and the rendering that produces it. The energetic cost of converting between matter and energy is set by the rendering rate's character, because the conversion is fundamentally a transaction with the rendering itself. This is the framework's reading of one of physics' most established equations. The equation stands. What it describes is reframed. That is episode 2, The architecture is purposive at the level of why and configured at the level of how, and the two levels are integrated. Matter exists because the primordium has reason to render it. Matter has the properties it has because those properties are what the rendering required to produce embedded perspective. An embedded perspective, limited, located, time-bound consciousness, is what the architecture exists to enable. In episode 3, we turn to consciousness, the answer to the question the architecture is configured to enable. What does it mean to be the perspective the primordium could not otherwise have? What is consciousness in a framework grounded in foundational consciousness? We turn to it next. Until then, thank you for listening.